Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Meadows Museum for the fourth and final of our four-part Luis Martín lecture series called the Alhambra and Beyond, Tracing Spain's Islamic Legacy. Eric Calderwood is a professor of comparative literature and Dean's Distinguished Professorial Scholar at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he's also the director of the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 2011, and his first book, Colonial Al-Andalus, Spain and the Making of Modern Moroccan Culture, was published by the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press in 2018. It's been translated into Arabic and Spanish and has won several awards, including the 2019 L. Carl Brown Ames Book Prize in North African Studies. His second book, On Earth or in Poems, The Many Lives of al-Andalus, was published by Harvard University Press in 2023 and was a finalist for the Sheikh Zayed Book Award in 2024. In addition to this amazing scholarship, Calderwood has contributed to public-facing venues like Foreign Policy, McSweeney's, NPR, and the BBC. And it is my pleasure now to invite him to the podium to finish out our series. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you so much, and for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? I am so happy to be with you here today at the Meadows Museum. It's such a thrill to be part of this exhibit. I want to start off by thanking Ann Kinseth and Cristina Aldrich for their really generous invitation to be here to speak with you. And I also want to thank all of you for your curiosity and interest, for showing up on a somewhat dreary Friday morning to talk about my passion, which is al-Andalus. It's such a treat to be able to share my work with a new audience. Thank you so much for being here. So for today, I've prepared a talk that should run about 45 minutes. So I took a few extra minutes beyond what I said I would. But for me, the most exciting part of any talk is always the ability to exchange in dialogue with the audience. So I really do hope, if your schedule allows, if you can stick around after the talk to have that dialogue. I'd love to hear your questions. And I'd also like to just encourage you to raise your hand and ask a question at any moment. I'm going to be speaking, but if I say something that you'd like me to clarify or to follow up on, feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm really here to have a conversation with you, so feel free to ask a question at any point. Okay, with that, let me begin. Let me see. I think I need to figure out how to advance the slides. There we go. So I'm here today to talk about a book that came out last year, On Earth or in Poems, The Many Lives of al-Andalus. What is this book about? Well, to answer that question, I'm going to have to define one of my key terms, which is al-Andalus. Now, I imagine that at this point in the lecture series, this term may be familiar to you, but since I'm going to be using it all throughout the talk, I'm just going to define it here to make sure that we're on the same page. Al-Andalus is the Arabic name for the parts of the Iberian Peninsula, so today's Spain and Portugal, that were ruled by Muslims from 711 to 1492. So as you can see, Al-Andalus in some ways ceased to exist or came to an end in 1492. But despite that apparent finality, the memories and legacies of al-Andalus have survived in many cultural forms, and they've continued to inspire cultural projects and political projects around the world. And this is where I return to the topic of my book, because I should say that my book is not really about al-Andalus proper. Instead, it's a book about the diverse uses and meanings of al-Andalus in contemporary culture. And the question that drives this book is, what does al-Andalus do? That is, how does al-Andalus create meaning and inspire art and activism for people in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond? How has al-Andalus helped diverse writers, artists, and communities to make sense of the world to articulate cultural identities, and even to imagine the future. In short, how has al-Andalus shaped the world we live in today? Now, as you might know, one of the most common ideas that's associated with al-Andalus today is this idea called convivencia. I see some people nodding their heads, so maybe you've heard this one before. Now, this is simply a Spanish term that means living together, but usually in the context of al-Andalus, it's used to refer to a specific idea about Andalusi history. The idea that al-Andalus was a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in relative peace and harmony. And I'm going to be coming back to this idea later in the talk. But I also want to say that convivencia is just one of many ideas that is associated today with al-Andalus. When I talk about my research publicly and with my students, and I used to say this as a joke, but now I've kind of incorporated it into my research talks, I like to think of al-Andalus as a kind of Swiss Army knife, because it's one of those weird sets of tools that's ready to address all kinds of different needs, depending on when you pull it out. For example, al-Andalus is the name of a world music ensemble in the United States, a shopping mall in Saudi Arabia, a historic cinema in the West Bank, and an Israeli publisher that specializes in the translation of Arabic literature into Hebrew. Al-Andalus, as many of you might know, is a major driver of tourism to Spain, and at the same time, it is a cornerstone of Moroccan national identity. In the Moroccan constitution, actually in the preamble, Moroccans claim Al-Andalus as a fundamental element of their national identity. In Al-Andalus, generations of Palestinian writers have found a metaphor for thinking about their homeland, while generations of feminist thinkers have found in al-Andalus a model for thinking about women's empowerment and creativity. So really what I'm trying to drive at here is that al-Andalus has proven incredibly malleable and useful for writers, artists, and audiences all around the world. And I could add to that list politicians, business people, and so on. So these different ideas and stories about al-Andalus, they circulate around the Mediterranean, from Cordoba to Cairo, from Paris to Beirut, from Tangier to the West Bank. But these are all also ideas that move far beyond the Mediterranean, encompassing people and places that you might not immediately associate with medieval Iberia. I'm talking about places like New York and Sao Paulo, Lahore, and Melbourne. In fact, one of those basic claims, and it might be so simple that it's not worth saying, but I'll say it anyway. One of the most basic claims that I'm making in this book is that stories and ideas about Al-Andalus circulate today very far from the historical site of Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, one of the ways I like to illustrate this point is actually to talk about the mosque in my hometown of Urbana, Illinois, which is a small city about 2 hours south of Chicago. Here's that mosque. I noticed this mosque on one of my first days in town in 2014, soon after moving to Urbana. It's only just a few blocks away from my house. So I was out for a walk. I walk by this building and I stop in my tracks because I immediately recognized its facade, the design of its facade with these arches and the alternating red and white stripes as an homage, as a gesture, as an allusion to one of the most famous monuments of Al-Andalus, the Mosque of Cordoba, which was built by the Umayyads in the 8th century and remains today the oldest Islamic heritage site in Europe. So here then, I discover on one of my first days in central Illinois, this modest but unmistakable tribute to Al-Andalus. I want to know more about how this came into being. What is the history of this building? And so I eventually reached out to the imam, and he put me in touch with one of the mosque's founding members. And he told me that the mosque's founders, he was one of them, had specifically chosen this design for the facade because they wanted their mosque to evoke, and I'm quoting his words here, the Cordoba environment, and to recall what Muslims had accomplished when they went to Europe. So in this case, we find a community of Muslims, largely Muslims from who are immigrants from Muslim majority countries, turning to the memory of al-Andalus in order to make sense of their place in Illinois and the United States. Now, I mentioned this mosque in Urbana not because it's exceptional, but precisely because it isn't. I could have just as easily spoken about Cordoba House in New York or about the Granada Theater, which I believe is just a few blocks away from us here in Dallas. The point is that the memory of al-Andalus is all around us, even if we don't always know how to read or recognize its signs. As a place, al-Andalus was anchored to one part of the map, the Iberian Peninsula. But al-Andalus is also an idea that has transcended this place and traveled all around the world, generating new meanings along the way. And this point, I think, gives me an opening to say something about my book's perhaps somewhat unusual title. The title comes from a poem by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who wrote in a poem from the 1990s, and in the end, we will ask ourselves, was al-Andalus here or there, on earth or in poems? So I'd be happy to say more about this poem in the Q&A and to talk about how this poem fits into a much longer tradition of Palestinian writing about al-Andalus. But for now, I just want to say that these lines from Darwish point to one of the central problems in my book, which is that al-Andalus is both a specific place in history, that's the unearthed part, but it's also a place in the imagination, that's the in poems part. And my book really represents my attempt to track al-Andalus's movements between these two spheres, between history and the imagination, past and present, and across space and time, in order to think about the diverse work that al-Andalus has continued to perform long after 1492, and especially in contemporary culture, and I should say especially for Muslim and Arab artists and audiences. I can say more about that in the Q&A if you'd like, but I decided to center this book largely around the voices and experiences of Muslim and Arab artists and writers. Though in this talk, I'm going to be focusing a bit more on the question of Spanish national identity. So one of the things I've learned from working on this topic is that the afterlife of al-Andalus is a really unruly object of study, one that spills over national, linguistic, and cultural lines. And one of the challenges I faced while working on this project was just figuring out how to organize the information. If I was arguing, as I am, that al-Andalus is Cordoba and Granada, yes, but it's also Melbourne and Lahore, New York and Sao Paulo, how am I going to write a book that can get its arms around that kind of vast and unwieldy corpus? I was guided by the conviction that any understanding of al-Andalus could not be contained within or reduced to a single cultural tradition or a single ideological project. And for that reason, I decided to organize the book thematically. So instead of one chronological progression, which is kind of how I was taught to write historically, moving from one year up closer and closer to the present, instead, I can think of this book a little bit more like the multiverse of al-Andalus, in which each chapter is exploring one of the uses or meanings that al-Andalus has acquired in contemporary culture. And part of what I'm trying to argue is that these competing and parallel meanings are happening at the same time at different parts in the world, and sometimes in the same place. And my book is an attempt to kind of track these parallel histories as they unfold across the world. So what are some of these case studies that I'm interested in? So for example, in the first two chapters, I tried to explore how the memory of al-Andalus and debates about al-Andalus have intersected with debates about ethnicity and race in North Africa and the Middle East, and in particular in debates about the construction of Arab identity and Berber or Amazigh identity in the Middle East and North Africa. In chapter 3, I try to shift from questions of ethnicity to questions of gender, to take up this question of how the memory of al-Andalus has fueled conversations about feminism and more broadly gender politics, particularly for Muslim and Arab female writers throughout the world, and in particular in North Africa and the Middle East. So in chapter 4, I then shift my attention to another field of political struggle, and I try to grapple with the diverse uses of al-Andalus in modern Palestinian culture, where al-Andalus has served as a metaphor for thinking about Palestine, but also as a vehicle for trying to imagine Palestinian futures. In chapter 5, the harmonious al-Andalus, which is kind of a play on words, I take up this question of convivencia, or interfaith coexistence, and I look at how a wide range of performing artists, particularly musicians, have engaged with this idea through music and sound. So for each case study in the book, for each of these chapters, the questions I'm trying to ask are, how and when did this particular understanding of al-Andalus come into being? As when did people start thinking of Andalus as an Arab thing, or a Palestinian thing, or a feminist thing, and so on? How has this idea found expression in a wide range of cultural texts? What is the genealogy of this idea? How has it been transmitted over a variety of texts? What are the political and cultural needs that it has served? Who benefits from talking about al-Andalus in this way? And what are the identities and communities that have formed around it? These are the many lives of al-Andalus of the book's subtitle. What emerges, I hope, from these inquiries is not so much a history of al-Andalus as it is a history of the present through the prism of al-Andalus. So I've provided an overview of the book structure here, just in case you'd like to ask about a particular chapter or idea in the Q&A. I'm happy to talk about any part of the book. But today I've actually decided to talk about a new part of the book. I've never spoken about this part of the book, so I'm really excited. Hopefully you'll bear with me as I work on some new material here. I'm going to be talking about the book's epilogue, Cordoba, Illinois. And the big questions that drive this epilogue are the following. How has the legacy of al-Andalus shaped debates about what it means to be Spanish and European in the 21st century? And how have these debates catalyzed similar debates about what it means to be a Muslim in the United States, or more broadly, more cultural and religious identities in the United States? That is to say, here I'm thinking about how al-Andalus has made it possible both to debate new meanings of what it means to be Spanish, but also to promote projects like that mosque I already referred to in my hometown in Urbana. Or we could even say the Granada Theater. I'm happy to talk about the Granada Theater if we want to. Usually when I do these talks, it's a kind of gimmick. I often have a local hook. And so we can talk a little bit about that if you'd like to. But to get at these questions that I have up here in the slide, I'm going to be focusing on one city, the city of Cordoba, which is the origin of the Umayyad capital that helped to inspire the Meadows Museum's exhibit. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on Cordoba's most famous building, the mosque or Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba. So just so I get a sense of the audience, by a show of hands, how many of you have visited this building before? My goodness. Okay, what a treat. I'll get like 2 hands, 1 hand. What an incredible treat it is to speak at the Meadows Museum. Okay, so some of the information I'm going to present here might be old hat for you. Please forgive me, but I really want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of this building, and then I'm going to tell you how it fits into my story. So the oldest section of this mosque, as some of you might already know then, was built in the late 8th century of the Common Era under Abdurrahman I, who was the first Umayyad Emir of al-Andalus. The mosque then went through several expansions in the 9th and 10th centuries and eventually grew to accommodate, we think, at least 40,000 worshippers. It's important to realize also that this building was not only the main place of worship in Cordoba, but it was also the main center of learning, where generations of scholars came to work and teach. So mosques in the medieval Muslim world and in Cordoba as well were not only places of worship, but also places of knowledge exchange. So this building's life as a functioning mosque came to an end in 1236, the year of the Christian conquest of Cordoba. But the building doesn't change then. Really, the city's new Christian rulers, they decided to consecrate the building as a cathedral, but to leave it mostly intact. And we think that's because these rulers realized that there might be more power in appropriating this extraordinary building than in destroying it or in altering it. So it's really not for another few hundred years that this building would really start to suffer any major transformations. And that would come in the 16th century when the bishop Alonso Manrique, working, I should say, against the opposition of the Cordoban community, decides to build this major transept, this major addition, basically a kind of church inside the mosque. So this new addition with its Gothic vaults and its Mannerist touches, really, for those of you who have visited the building, you know this, it marks a very sharp contrast with the Umayyad mosque that frames it. And this stark juxtaposition of styles has remained in place until the current day. So today we can really think of this as a monument that elicits really mind-bending descriptions because it's a kind of wonder and an oddity at the same time, right? It's a medieval Islamic heritage site that has a 16th century church inside of it. It is the seat of Cordoba's bishop and at the same time the symbol of the city's Muslim heritage. So these are the tensions that this building carries with it. And for the past several years, probably because of these tensions, this monument has been embroiled in a controversy that has started to expose some really big questions about the building's meaning, its management, and its identity. Now, this is a controversy that has drawn in diverse constituencies from all over Cordoba and from all over Spanish society. But really, at its core, it's a conflict that has pitted two groups against each other. On the one hand, a coalition of mostly left-wing citizen activists from Cordoba. And on the other hand, the church authorities in Cordoba, and particularly the cathedral chapter, which is the name of the ecclesiastical body that is in charge of managing this site. The confrontation between these two groups, I think, has spawned a whole set of thorny questions about the legacies of al-Andalus, legacies that are both tangible and intangible. And some of the questions that have emerged here revolve around these questions of cultural identity. These are questions like, is the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba a Christian building, a Muslim building, or somehow a building that confounds or transcends either of those categories? Is this an Andalusi building that we're looking at? Is it a Spanish building? Or is it a building that somehow embodies a multicultural palimpsest that predates but continues to inform contemporary Spanish society? So these are kind of some of the big identity questions that emerge in this building. But there are also some questions about ownership that have emerged in this building. Now, these questions of ownership have both a literal dimension and a symbolic dimension. And I'm going to be talking more about the symbolic dimension in this talk. But just to tell you what I mean about the literal dimension, in 2006, the church actually registered this building as its private property through a somewhat obscure legal maneuver that's called immatriculation. Now, this surreptitious maneuver was done in secrecy, and it didn't really come to light for several years afterwards. But when the public found out, and particularly people in Cordoba, it spawned this huge outcry because people really were trying to argue that this building is a public good and not the church's private dominion. So these disputes, I would say, over the ownership of the Mosque Cathedral and of many other monuments that have been claimed by the church using this same maneuver, I think that they signal ongoing disputes in Spanish society about the management of historical sites, particularly when these historical sites are major sources of revenue, of tourism revenue. But the question that I've posed about ownership is really not just limited to this issue of property rights, right? It's not just about land deeds and revenues, but it's also about stories and the right to tell them. Indeed, the problems that I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this talk are less of that juridical nature, like who's got the deed, and more of this symbolic nature, who tells the story? What are the demands and claims that al-Andalus has placed on the present? Really, the questions that this building elicits, I think, are a microcosm for the questions that I pursue throughout my book. These are questions like, who has inherited the legacies of al-Andalus and what have they done with them? How has the legacy of al-Andalus shaped or sometimes served as a foil to the construction of collective identities in the present? And really, essentially, this question of story, who gets to tell the story or the stories of al-Andalus, particularly when these are stories that enlist diverse actors, historical periods, and political imaginaries. What I'm trying to argue here and kind of how I think about this building is I think of this iconic mosque as a sort of Rorschach test where viewers see diverse and sometimes divergent patterns of history. And I think that thinking about this building, like thinking about al-Andalus itself, demands of us that we think in multiple timescales and with multiple audiences in mind. So building from that present, I take this story of the mosque cathedral as a sort of parable that helps us to understand the elastic and unresolved legacies of al-Andalus in Spain today. So since the turn of the 21st century, I apologize, I won't keep asking you to raise your hands, but how many of you have visited the building in the last 10 years? Okay, many of you have been. The building has actually gone through some very significant changes in the last 10 years. So depending on what year you went there, you might have seen a very different building. I'm going to be talking about those changes now. And this is because since the 21st century, since the beginning of the 21st century, the cathedral chapter of Cordoba, so this body that's in charge of managing the site, it's been engaged in a wide-ranging effort to stress the building's Christian identity while downplaying and sometimes even erasing the building's Muslim heritage. So this is an effort that has taken many forms and has unfolded in many different kinds of media, in print and online, in exhibits and archaeological excavations, in signage at the site, and in statements to the press. You might have heard, for example, there was a moment in 2014 and 15 in which if you Googled the Mosque of Cordoba, it did not exist, according to Google, because the cathedral chapter was able to scrub that phrase from Google Maps. So one of the ways to track these efforts is to look at the various tourist brochures that the cathedral chapter has distributed at the site over the past 4 decades. So I'm trying to sort of build on the incredible work that Cristina has already done here to talk about how tourism reflects and in some cases shapes our understanding of what al-Andalus is. So I just want to look at a few of the tourist brochures and show how they reflect evolving understandings of what this building is. So from 1981 to 1998, this is when I visited the building for the first time, the brochures called the building the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba, and they began with the following description, and I'm quoting. The Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba is, according to Francisco Chueca, the foremost monument of all of the Islamic West and one of the most wondrous ones of the world. It sums up in its archaeological history the complete evolution of Umayyad art in Spain, that is, of the Hispano-Muslim style in the era of its greatest splendor. So as you can see, the brochure's opening paragraph stressed the monument's Islamic identity, its influence throughout the Islamic world, and its close association with the Umayyad dynasty in al-Andalus. Continuing in this vein, the brochure went on to explain, and I'm quoting, the fundamental parts of the building are the old minaret, the courtyard, and the prayer room. In other words, the brochure was pointing visitors to the part of the building that made it most legible as a mosque. And this is an understanding of the building and of its primary characteristics that would gain steam also in the 1980s when UNESCO recognized the Mosque of Cordoba, using that phrase, as a World Heritage Site. And the UNESCO citation described the building as an irreplaceable testimony of the Caliphate of Cordoba and the most emblematic monument of Islamic religious architecture. So as you can see, for both the UNESCO authorities and for the authors of these brochures in the 1980s and 1990s, this building's claim to fame, the reason you visited it, was its historic status as a mosque from al-Andalus, as a mosque from the Umayyad era. But in the late 1990s, and really with increasing vigor through the first decades of the 21st century, the cathedral chapter started to modify its tourist brochures and to reflect a different understanding of this building, its history, and its identity. So this evolution began in 1998 when the cathedral chapter published a new brochure titled Brief Guide to the Holy Cathedral Church, former Mosque of Cordoba. Now, the change, a somewhat subtle change, you might say, to the monument's official name, highlighting the building's current status as a cathedral while noting its former status as a mosque, was really a subtle change of things to come. Because in the early 21st century, around 2000, I've had trouble dating exactly when this brochure was issued, the cathedral chapter issued a new brochure with a much more assertive vision of the monument's Christian identity and history. The new brochure was titled The Cathedral of Cordoba, Living Testament of Our History. And its opening section, titled Mother Church of the Diocese, offered, I think, a stark illustration of the change in tone and vision. It began, and I quote, "The cathedral chapter welcomes you to this holy cathedral church of Cordoba. The whole compound in this singular building that you are going to visit was consecrated as the mother church of the diocese in the year 1236. In this beautiful and grandiose temple, since then, when without missing a single day, the church celebrates solemn worship, and the Christian community gathers to listen to the word of God and to participate in the sacraments. In welcoming you to this cathedral, the cathedral chapter asks that your visit to the building be respectful of the identity of this Christian temple, the Cathedral of Cordoba." Excuse me. So I think if you compare this opening statement to the one that I read before that appeared in the tourist brochures from the 1980s and 90s, some significant changes start to become immediately apparent. While the earlier brochures described this building as the foremost monument of all of the Islamic West, that's a quote, this new brochure's introduction did not make a single allusion to the building's previous life as a mosque. And actually, I'd say that the anonymous authors went to great lengths to stress the building's Christian identity, as well as its continuous and uninterrupted function as a place of Christian worship from 1236 to the present. Even more striking, perhaps, was their decision to relegate all 5 centuries of the Muslim presence in Cordoba to a sidebar that was titled the Islamic Intervention. For many local observers, especially critics of the cathedral chapter's actions, the phrase the Islamic Intervention carried the implication that the 5 centuries of Muslim rule in Cordoba were merely a parenthesis that did not fundamentally alter the longer and uninterrupted story of Iberian Christianity. Now, one of the cathedral chapter's main strategies for upholding this view has been to insist that this monument was, in fact, a church before it was a mosque. And if any of you have visited this building in the last 10 years, you'll have seen this. In particular, the church claims that the Umayyads built their mosque on top of a Visigothic church called the Basilica of St. Vincent. Now, I should acknowledge there's some scholarly debate on this issue, but the many archaeologists and historians have looked into this question, have really concluded that there's not much evidence to suggest the presence of a Visigoth basilica on the site where the Umayyad mosque was built in the 8th century. And even the team of experts that was hired precisely by the cathedral church to find the remains of the Basilica of St. Vincent concluded in a statement to the press in January 2020, "We have not been able to identify a Christian basilica underneath the Mosque of Cordoba." This is what the church's own experts concluded. So although the prior existence of a Visigothic basilica at the site of the mosque is, I think, at best, debatable, the church authorities have treated it as an incontrovertible fact and have made it a centerpiece of their narrative about the building's history and identity. Now, this process really started to gain steam in January 2005 when the church inaugurated a new museum called the Museum of St. Vincent. This museum, which is still there today, features display cases with a selection of Visigothic and Roman materials found on the site over the last century of excavations. At the same time, the cathedral chapter's curators made an important intervention in the oldest section of the mosque, the section that was built in the 8th century under Abdul Rahman. There, where tourists enter the building, the curators opened a patch of floor and replaced it with a glass viewing window that reveals pebble mosaic below. And a nearby plaque that's still there today identifies the mosaic as part of the Basilica of St. Vincent. I think the purpose of these interventions was clear. They implied that the Christian consecration of the church, of the building in 1236, and the subsequent insertion of a large transept and choir, that these were not interventions or impositions on a Muslim structure, but were instead restorations of the building's original identity as a Christian structure. And this message was certainly not lost on the Cordoban public. When a local journalist covered the inauguration of the Museum of St. Vincent for the newspaper Córdoba in January of 2005, he wrote, "From now on, the Arab mosque will no longer be able to be explained without first mentioning its historical origin, Christian, that of St. Vincent." So in the face of these efforts by the church to lay claim to Cordoba's most iconic monument and to stress its Christian identity, a group of citizen activists joined forces in 2013 and began to advocate for a different vision of the building's past, present, and future. This group called themselves the Platform for the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba, Heritage for All. And from now on, I'm just going to refer to this group as the Platform, just for short. Their first high-profile action, maybe this came across your desk because it was covered by the New York Times. Their first high-profile action came in early 2014 when they launched an online petition demanding that the word mosque be restored to the official title of the monument, not only in the tourist brochures, but also online and on the website and on Google Maps and so on. They also called for the mosque cathedral to be administered by a public entity instead of by the Catholic Church. This petition would go viral and would eventually attract nearly 400,000 signatures, including ones from such luminaries as the British architect Norman Foster and the Spanish writer Juan Goytisolo. It also caught the attention of several major media outlets such as Al Jazeera, the New York Times, and El País, which is Spain's leading daily newspaper. Now, this massive media attention both launched the platform into the limelight, but it also launched them into a pretty big confrontation with the Catholic Church, and particularly with the cathedral chapter. And this is a confrontation that continues to the present day. Now, I've been doing interviews with this group, the Platform, for the past 9 years, and my sense is that what bothers them, what really sticks in their craws, what rankles them, is their impression that the church authorities are engaged in a wholesale rewriting of local and national history. In an article that they published in 2020, leaders from the Platform asserted that the case of the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba illustrates, and I quote, "The damage that is inflicted on a monument when its history is falsified, its identity manipulated, its immaterial values mutilated, its narrative interpretation adulterated, its authenticity disfigured, and a substantial part of its character hidden." In the same article, the authors accused the church of identity theft and symbolic destruction. Those are their phrases. And similar views have surfaced in my conversations and interviews with the Platform's members over the past several years. For example, in my first conversations with Miguel Santiago, who's the spokesperson for the Platform, he accused the Catholic Church of, and I'm quoting, "denying the true history of the monument and of nullifying history." And in a similar vein, Antonio Manuel, who's another prominent figure in the Platform, told me that the cathedral chapter was, quote, "colonizing the mosque and falsifying memory." Why does this matter so much? I think for many of the platform's members, what is at stake in this dispute is far more than a tourist site. It's a whole network of ideals and aspirations that they associate with this building and more broadly with the legacies of al-Andalus. The members of the platform often refer to the mosque cathedral and even to Cordoba itself as a paradigm. For instance, Antonio Manuel called the building a universal paradigm of respect for difference in an op-ed that he published in El País in September 2013. And he elaborated on this point in one of his interviews with me when he told me, and I quote, "I belong to a culture whose core identifying feature is inclusion and not exclusion. The Andalusi paradigm," there's that paradigm word, "far from being a myth, is a tool of extraordinary social utility in this day and age. And I believe that it is necessary for us to look for cultural paradigms that allow us citizens to be equal in rights from a perspective of respect for difference. And that paradigm is architecturally in the Mosque of Cordoba." So as this comment indicates, Antonio Manuel sees the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba as the architectural embodiment of a local tradition of convivencia. And it's a view that he shares with many of his colleagues in the platform. For example, in that article that was published in 2020, representatives from the platform hailed the Mosque Cathedral as, and I'm quoting, "a singular paradigm of artistic mixing and convivencia between cultures." I think that this dispute between the platform and the church carries such urgency because in the end, it's not just about adjudicating the past, right? This dispute at its core is not only about what Cordoba was or has been, it's also about what Cordoba will be or could be. For the platform's members, the Mosque Cathedral has social utility, that's the phrase that Antonio Manuel used, because it encourages Cordoba's citizens, and I would say people outside of Cordoba as well, to think about living with and appreciating cultural difference. Miguel Santiago summed up this vision when he told me, and I quote, "We have a monument that makes the world realize that coexistence is possible, that mixing is possible, that it is possible for us to live together just as the different architectural styles live together, just as the different faiths have lived together." Now, I should say that the platform won a pretty important victory in 2016 when Andalusia's regional government ruled or ordered that the cathedral chapter restore the word mosque to the monument's official name and its publications. So if you go to the site today, you'll see that the brochures now refer to it as the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba Monumental Complex. But this name change, I would say, has not really resolved the underlying disagreements about the building's meaning and management. And if anything, I would say that the cathedral chapter has doubled down in its efforts to assert the building's Christian identity. Tourist visits to the building still begin with this stop at the display window overlooking the supposed remains of the Basilica of St. Vincent, even though several experts have cast serious doubt on that basilica's existence. Inside the building, and those of you who have been there recently might have noticed this, there are periodic announcements over the loudspeakers reminding visitors, quote, "You are on a cultural visit to a Catholic temple." And this message is reinforced by the abundant Catholic iconography that the cathedral chapter has distributed throughout the most emblematic spaces of the former mosque. And this is a practice that is, I would say, intensified during the Christmas and Easter seasons when images of Jesus and the Virgin Mary kind of proliferate all throughout the space. So among the many incidents that have spawned an outcry in recent years has been the cathedral church's decision to place a large statue of St. John of Avila right next to the prayer niche, the mihrab, that was built under the Umayyad Caliph al-Hakam in the 10th century. Another flare-up came in September 2019 when the cathedral chapter decided to place 43 Nazarenos, so depictions of Jesus carrying the cross, inside the iconic arches that stretched through the former mosque's prayer halls. Representatives of the platform have decried such acts as a symbolic occupation whose aim is to underline the building's status as a cathedral and to efface its Muslim heritage. Although Cordoba's Muslim heritage is central to the platform's discourse, I want to note that the city's Muslim community has actually been noticeably absent from the platform's activities. In other words, these debates surrounding Cordoba's most famous Islamic heritage site have mostly involved non-Muslim actors using that site as a proxy to debate larger questions of identity. At the same time, Cordoba's growing Muslim community has, for the most part, remained on the sidelines of these ongoing disputes. And there's several reasons for that state of affairs, and I go into them in much greater depth in the book. But I want to give you just a little taste here by discussing one of the responses from one of the major Muslim organizations in the city, which is the Association of Muslims in Cordoba. Now, this association has maintained a discrete profile in the ongoing dispute between the cathedral chapter and the platform. And the association's president, Kamal Makhalif, has insisted that he and the other members of the association want to maintain good relations with the city's Christian community, and that they have no interest, for example, in praying in the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba. But in my conversations with Makhalif and with many other Muslims in the city, I heard a concern that was repeated many times, which is this concern about the fact that Muslim visitors to the building often report being followed or even openly harassed by the security staff at the site. Makhalif himself has often experienced this harassment when he visits the site with out-of-town visitors and family members. An even greater concern for Makhalif is what the recent controversies have revealed about how non-Muslim Spaniards imagine their relationship to Spain's Muslim heritage. On this point, he told me, there's an attempt to falsify history and to make people, that is the Spanish themselves, believe that all that civilization was something alien to them. And that's not how it is, because it's something that came from here. Because I've always said it is Cordoban. Ibn Hazm was Cordoban. Abul Qasis was Cordoban. They weren't from Arabia or Algeria or Morocco. They were Cordoban. And people, I'm talking about non-Muslims, should be proud of that history. The concern Makhalif voices here is that the cathedral chapter's actions are symptomatic of a broader effort to excise Muslims from Cordoban and Spanish history. Makhalif worries that cultural luminaries from Muslim Cordoba, such as the philosopher Ibn Hazm and the physician known as Abul Qasis, have not been incorporated into narratives of collective identity, either at the local or the national level. And this problem, he's suggesting, has implications for how non-Muslim Spaniards imagine their relationship to Andalusi heritage sites like the Mosque of Cordoba. It also, of course, has implications for how Muslim immigrants to Spain, such as Makhalif himself, imagine their relationship to al-Andalus and understand their place in the fabric of Spanish society. I think that the big question that looms in the background here is, are Muslims, both past and present, integral parts of Spanish culture, or are they somehow alien to it? While Makhalif has not participated in the platform's activities, he shares the platform's sense that the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba is a flashpoint for unresolved debates about what it means to be Cordoban and Spanish. So I'm going to move here to my conclusion. What are we to do then with all of these unresolved debates and these multiple meanings of Cordoba and al-Andalus? Here, I've been focusing on what al-Andalus means in the context of Cordoba, but I've also suggested that in other parts of the book, I'm asking that same question: what does it mean in Palestine? What does it mean in Morocco? What does it mean in Illinois? What are we to do with those multifarious meanings of al-Andalus? So I've tried not to be overly prescriptive in my book, and I've tried not to be overly prescriptive in this talk, but I do want to offer some final reflections on these questions, because this is, after all, a lecture series about how we engage with and think about the legacy of al-Andalus today. First, I want to propose that we might need to reframe the questions that we use to think about and study the legacies of al-Andalus. For me, at the moment, I think the primary question that we need to ask ourselves is not so much what al-Andalus was, but rather how al-Andalus and its memories have continued to manifest across the world, serving different needs as they travel from place to place. In other words, I'm returning to that question that I kind of tried to pose at the beginning of the talk. What does al-Andalus do? I'm trying to reframe the kind of static al-Andalus as something that happened in the past, and we debate the past, to what is the action that al-Andalus is doing for us now? How does it shape our understanding of the world? And this is certainly true for Cordobans and Spaniards, but I would argue for those of us in the room, it's also true for all of us here as well. How has al-Andalus shaped the world we live in? Second, I want to suggest that representing al-Andalus and laying claim to its legacies is not a zero-sum game. What I mean to say is that I think we need to move from a competitive understanding of al-Andalus to a multi-directional understanding of al-Andalus, one in which different articulations of the past confront each other in the public sphere without having one necessarily eliminate the others. And building from that premise, I want to suggest that the aim of thinking about al-Andalus should always be one of increasing complexity rather than resolving it or dispelling it. Al-Andalus, I think, is, if nothing else, a tool, a heuristic for complicating categories that we might think of as static, such as what does it mean to be Spanish? Now, one way to honor this goal of complexity, I think, is to move beyond thinking of al-Andalus as a finite object of study and moving toward thinking of it as a sort of method. What do I mean by that? I think al-Andalus as a method means thinking across and beyond the categories of collective identity and belonging that have shaped the world and have shaped academic disciplines. I'm referring, for example, to the continental boundaries between Europe, Africa, and Asia, the linguistic boundaries between Arabic, Spanish, Hebrew, and several other languages, the confessional boundaries between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and the political and ethical boundaries between self and other. To put this, this all might seem very abstract, but I'm asking a question we might take for granted that Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East should and are studied separately and not as interconnected unities. We might take for granted the idea that Arabic was in Spanish but is not a Spanish language. Why? And I say why. Arabic is a language that has an older and a continuous presence in the Iberian Peninsula, much older than Castilian itself. What does it mean to imagine the Arabic language, for example, as integral to what it means to be Spanish? These are some of the questions I think that al-Andalus helps us to pose. And I'm not suggesting that al-Andalus, when we use it as a method, is a sort of magical wand that whisks away these boundaries. I'm simply saying that it never takes them for granted. Al-Andalus is this really powerful tool because it helps us to map how these boundaries came into being and how over time they've helped us to construct different categories of belonging. And I think it's also helpful because it's this reminder that all of these boundaries are contingent and permeable. They're subject to the flows of space and time, to stories that move across space and time, just like the arches of medieval Cordoba that echo far away in my hometown in central Illinois. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
I would
much.
love your questions. I see that I went over time and I apologize for that.
You're fine. So we'll just have hands raised and I will bring the microphone. The microphone is really loud, so keep that in mind.
Thank you. Does it sound okay?
Yes, I can hear you
No,
perfectly.
this is a comment, not a question. I have been there twice
Sure.
over, say, a long period of time, say
Sure.
maybe over 25 years. There is no question in the more recent visit, the heavy influence was there on the cathedral versus the mosque, but I had no idea of the background and the history that you have provided.
If you don't mind me piggybacking on that comment, as someone who's a kind of a cultural historian of Spain, very often, I was trained to think about 20th century Spanish history as a kind of history of two Spains. One is which you have the kind of history of the Franco regime that was advocating for a kind of monolingual, monocultural, robustly Catholic understanding of Spain. And then you have the kind of post-Franco Spain, which is this explosion of a new pluralist, multicultural understanding of Spain. One of the great ironies, I think, of this story in Cordoba is that under the Franco regime, it was actually quite common for Muslims to pray in the Mosque of Cordoba. One of the major pieces of the Franco regime's outreach to the Muslim world was, in fact, inviting Muslims to visit the Muslim heritage sites of Spain, to interact with them, and even to pray in them in the case of Cordoba. And so you have this. This is one of these stories that, I'm not, by no means am I trying to rehabilitate the Franco regime. I'm simply trying to trouble the somewhat fixed binaries that we have for understanding that somehow things always get better, they get more progressive, they move more and more towards understanding. It's actually true that in the past 25 years, there's been a real hardening around these questions of what this building means and how it can be used. Thank you for your comment.
I'm going to go to the back and then I'll come back to the front. Oh, thank you.
That was really beautiful. In addition to the Granada Theater, do you have any observations on how al-Andalus was influences Texas by way of the discovery, the settlement, etc.?
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. I through repeated attempts to reach out to the Granada Theater, they're not buying my wares. They've not responded to me. I was going to have a whole Granada Theater shtick, but it just became a slide. I'll say something about the Granada Theater, and then I'll kind of pivot from there to the broader question of Texas. So the Granada Theater, as far as I understand, was opened in the 1940s and was part of a whole fashion of what we might call Alhambresque, to use a term that Cristina brought up in earlier lectures, Alhambresque themes in leisure spaces and entertainment spaces. So this is a moment in which the Alhambra becomes, in the American imaginary, a site of kind of ludic entertainment and leisure. And so you have Alhambra and Granada themed movie theaters proliferating around the country in the first half of the 20th century. And we could maybe associate that with the legacy of Washington Irving that Cristina's already told us about. Now, more broadly, and I think that this is the question that you were talking to, how has al-Andalus shaped Texas, the south of what is today the United States? I think I might start by pointing to the experience of Muslims, not just in the United States, but specifically in Texas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Centro Islámico, the Islamic Center in Houston. Has anyone heard of this? So this is one of the Muslim organizations in Houston. It's a Spanish language Muslim organization in Houston, largely, though not exclusively, of Latinx converts to Islam. And for them, al-Andalus is extremely important as a way of imagining not only being Latinx in the United States, but also being Latinx and Muslim in the United States as not a kind of new radical imposition, but something that's actually deeply rooted, that's actually older than the country itself. Many of you will know that like one of the earliest European accounts of what is today Texas, so that would be the Narvaez expedition that was written up by the Cabeza de Vaca, had on it a Moroccan Muslim slave, who himself, we believe, was what? Yeah, naufragios. Yeah, exactly. The naufragios is the Spanish title. Exactly, and that book has recently been, the Naufragios, which is the Cabeza de Vaca Chronicle, has recently been reimagined by a Moroccan author, Leila Lalami, in a novel called The Moor's Account, in which she tries to reimagine that initial encounter between Europe, Africa, and the Americas through the eyes of this enslaved Moroccan. And in that case, it is very much an attempt to reimagine the place of Muslims as integral parts, as very old and integral parts to this part of the country, not just the United States broadly, but specifically to this part of the country. And I'd say that imaginary, which tries to track the movement, very often the movement of enslaved people, but the movement of enslaved Muslims right after, so in the 100 years after 1492 into what is today Texas, is one of the ways in which both Latinx and Muslim people have used al-Andalus as a way of situating themselves in the broader history of this region. I hope that responds to your question. And if you haven't read the Moor's account by al-Alami, it's wonderful.
Um, Hi. So
Anna.
this is very loud. My question is perhaps very broad
Sure.
and might need its own lectures. So I apologize.
I think
But
I've already shown I like to talk about al-Andalus.
okay. My question is, you use the term imaginary and imagination,
Yeah.
and it's something I'm grappling with in my own research. So I wanted to ask, how do you come to this very fluid term? How do you define it in the context of your practice as a historian and as a scholar?
Thank you. It's such a wonderful question. I really appreciate it. I'm not sure if I can do it justice, but I'm going to try to reflect on this. Another word I could have used might have been myth, for example. The reasons that I like and don't like the word myth, I think because colloquially we usually use the word myth to mean a story that's not true. I prefer the kind of anthropological understanding of myth as a story that has social utility, meaning a story that's useful for making sense of the world. And in that sense, I think of al-Andalus as a myth, not in the sense that it wasn't true, but in the sense that it's a story that we use now to make sense of the world. And that's the kind of imaginative space I'm trying to work in. I'm also trying to work, so I haven't said that much about myself as a person, as a scholar, but I should just say that I was originally trained as a medievalist, as a scholar of al-Andalus. And I don't know if now I'm just a bad medievalist or I'm doing something different. But something that medievalists love to do when they're talking about al-Andalus is that here's the move. They'll go, so in the 19th century, X or Y said this about al-Andalus. Here's why that's not true. They really want to control the territory. They want to make sure it's clear that we're separating when we're talking about al-Andalus and when we're talking about something else. I absolutely understand and respect that gesture, particularly at a time in which people are using the medieval past for all kinds of bad political projects that we might not want to align ourselves with. That said, it's a gesture that also forecloses a bunch of other really interesting questions. Like, okay, even if that doesn't match up with my understanding of al-Andalus, why is that understanding of al-Andalus useful to the person who's doing it? And why is it that some stories about al-Andalus take off and others don't? I could tell you, al-Andalus, it is the center of world clown culture. And probably you'd be like, yeah, I don't think that doesn't really make sense to me. It's not useful for making sense of the world. Some ways of talking about it are useful to people and others that aren't. And that's the dynamic that I'm interested in. The other reason I've been focusing on this question of the imaginary is I've been trying to get myself out of a bind that I would call the bind of nostalgia. I think a lot of the literature in al-Andalus, the scholarly literature, I should say, is really wrapped up in this question of backward looking al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is always about lamenting the lost past. It's always a backward-looking enterprise. And here I'm trying to imagine this is how the history and imagination thing works. Is there a way that we can use al-Andalus to do something that's more productive in the present and maybe even more productive toward the future? Yeah, I'm really trying to imagine an al-Andalus that is respectful of my training as a medievalist, but also equally curious about what al-Andalus could tell us about the now and maybe even about the later.
And that's the imagination.
Yeah, that's the imagination. And this way of coming about thinking about al-Andalus was really, one of the places I came to this was actually reading people around the world writing about al-Andalus and seeing what they were doing with it, because I was dissatisfied with the dominant scholarly account that people only talk about al-Andalus to lament the past. So I just wanted to bring in this quote. This is from Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet who plays an important, he's the person who gave me the title for this book. And he said in this interview with Le Monde in 1983, Palestine is not a memory, but rather an existence, not a past, but rather a future. Palestine is the aesthetics of al-Andalus. It is the Andalus of the possible. Now, I go into much greater detail about the context in which he said that in the book, but I really just want to focus on the last part. It is the Andalus of the possible. When I say imagination, I'm asking, what has al-Andalus made possible for writers, for artists, for audiences and communities around the world? And I think that that's a question that's never can be entirely devoid from this question of history. That's why I say on earth or in poems. But there's always something that exceeds that earthly historic referent, particularly when we're talking about al-Andalus today in the 21st century. Does that respond to your question? Thank you.
Yes, it's loud. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you so
that-
much for being here.
That's better, right? I cannot wait to read your book.
Thank
And
you.
I'm actually quite emotional right now when you talk about the future. I just wanted to share with you in 2019, we belonged to Temple Emmanuel, which is a very large Reformed Jewish congregation here in Dallas.
Mhm.
And many of us went on a tour of medieval Spain.
Mm.
And the whole focus of the trip was exactly what you're talking about, but including, and I was completely blown away to learn this, the head of the army at one point was Jewish
Mhm.
when the Muslim people were in charge. And that's why I'm kind of emotional. I mean, it's been quite a week and quite a year, but I completely support your main point about imagining the future of people getting along and your whole emphasis on multicultural.
Mm.
So I just wanted to thank you. And how do I get a copy of your book? Because I would love to read it.
My goodness, I'm so honored. Thank you so much for your interest and for sharing your experiences. The book is available on Amazon. It's also available through my publisher, Harvard University Press. I understand that the museum's gift shop might have ordered some copies of it, so
Okay, good.
potentially it'd be there.
Okay.
But I would say I very much appreciate your interest, and I also, for those of you who are on the fence about whether or not you want to read a book about al-Andalus, but want a little bit of taste of something more, I've also created a Spotify playlist in which I've curated the music that I talk about in the book and that helped to inspire the book. And so maybe I can share that link with Cristina as well if you're interested.
Would be great.
You could listen to the book in that way. That's another way. Though of course I and my publishers would very much appreciate it if you bought the book. And thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so
I
much.
appreciate it.
Okay. There's someone back here. Okay. So I'm going to come here and as promised, next up, other side, and then I can come back over here.
Thank you, Eric. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I loved the lady's question over there about the influence in Texas. You can't get in the Granada Theater while you're here. The two of the three oldest shopping centers in the United States are here in Dallas. Helen Park Village and Casa Linda Plaza. All cultural icons to our city that have developed the most culturally vibrant communities.
Wonderful. Okay.
They have theaters.
I'll have to write those names down so I can do a little Dallas tour. Thank you.
Yeah. And my question is, I can't get past the architectural language inside the mosque with all the black columns and the degradation of the top. Is that intentional neglect of the erosion? To me, it seems like a dichotomy of the celestial ceiling and the human support of the entire structure inside.
These right here?
Yeah, the black columns.
Yeah.
And the way they've become gray on the top.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that I don't see a lot of, if you know, it could be that the picture is not very good. A lot of degradation in these in the stone columns themselves. It just has to do with the columns and the capitals and the arches above them are all in three different kinds of materials. And so I think that this might be the sort of natural marbling you get with the age of, I believe these are granite. Is someone who's a geologist, which I'm not. I believe this is black granite stone. So I think there might be some marbling. Though if I could kind of piggyback on your question to answer another question that I think is at the back of it is like, what does it mean to restore well? Is not an easy question. And I think that part of the challenges that we face when we visit Andalusi heritage sites is that regimes of restoration, so different ideas about what it means to restore a building well, have changed a lot since, say, the 19th century, when you start getting these major interventions in these buildings. And also alongside them, what stories these buildings are supposed to tell us. Those have changed as well. And so you always have this conflict when someone's restoring a building. What is the most respectful way to preserve? And what is the most respectful way to tell the story that I think this building tells? You know, something I've thought about this question a lot more actually in the context of the Alhambra than I am in Cordoba of the mosque, but I'll just say maybe very briefly a kind of reflection on that, because I know a lot of the other lectures were focusing on the Alhambra. One of the questions I like to ask myself, and I've never actually brought students there, but if I did, I think I'd probably ask them, like, when is this building from? Like, what is the building that we see? Because so much of the Alhambra is the product of much later restorations, 19th, 20th, even 21st restorations. And so really when we're seeing the Alhambra, when we're seeing any of these buildings, what we're seeing is the accretion of not just a medieval building, but an accretion of several centuries of interpretation that is made manifest through restoration practices on top of them. And so I think with all of these buildings, we need to be curious, not just about the jump between the 21st century, and the moment in which we think they might date from, say the 8th century for this building, the 13th and 14th centuries for the Granada, for the Alhambra, but what are all the intermediate stages and how do they make themselves known to us? And so this is something I've thought a lot more in the context of the Alhambra, and I'd be happy to build there. In terms of where the money goes, I mean, I think that, you know, I don't want to flatten people's experiences, but I think it's safe to say that no one visits this building to visit some pretty ugly transept in the middle of it. I'm sad. Like I say that, you know, like I love a Baroque church as much as the next guy, but that's not what's extraordinary about this building. People go to see the mihrab, the prayer niche. People go to see this wondrous arch, this forest of arches that kind of extend back into the background. And so I do think it's troublesome that the cathedral chapter has invested so much of the tourism revenue that comes, like, they get the money. This does not go to the city of Cordoba. The church gets the money for all the tickets, and they've invested so much of it in signage around a basilica that most experts say doesn't exist, and in adding crosses to the tops of every single lantern in the mosque area to make sure, you know, even there in those former prayer halls, it's a cathedral now. And so I think of that as a form of mismanagement, but obviously that's less from a restoration perspective and more from what stories do you think this building should tell? I don't know if I've answered your question directly, but I've tried my best. Thank you so much.
I think I have to disagree with that idea.
Go ahead.
You know,
simultaneously for worship.
Sorry, which
Both religions have a practice that in the same period.
There's some debate about this. There's some debate about whether initially at the moment when the Umayyad Mosque was built in the 8th century, whether there was a moment in which the Christian community had some use of the building. I think the general consensus is no. But what we know, most of what we know in the building starts in the kind of late 8th century under Abd al-Rahman I, but that's already about 80 years into the history of al-Andalus. I would say the most vibrant efforts to have ecumenical use of the space, so across different religious communities, actually happened in the 20th century and was pretty closely aligned with Spanish colonialism in Morocco. So one of the ways in which the Spanish had a colonial presence in Morocco from 1859 to 1956, you might have heard a little bit about that in former lectures through the Fortuny, for example, who's an arborist who visited Morocco. One of the ways in which the Spanish justified or claimed that they were the kind of right colonizers, the right colonial power for Morocco, was to assert that they were the inheritors of the legacy of al-Andalus. So very often when Moroccan dignitaries were brought to Spain, they were brought to the various Islamic heritage sites and encouraged to interact with them, to see them both as part and parcel of their heritage, but also part and parcel of Spanish heritage. It was one way of encouraging this idea of brotherhood, which is one of the main metaphors of Spanish colonialism. And so you do have many examples of Muslim groups and Christian groups visiting this site together throughout the 20th century and praying. Strangely, those all ended in the 1970s. And so I just say strangely because I think that cuts against the grain of how we imagine where Islam fits into the history of Spain and the relationship between Islam, Spanish identity, and the Franco regime. The Franco regime, though known for its very assertive Catholicism, also had this very interesting kind of outreach to the Muslim world. And so that was another period where you'd see people using the building together. I think your colleague was also going to disagree with something I said. Do you want to go ahead?
I was just going to say, architecture that lasts for thousands of years is always repurposed and reused by the culture in which the architecture remains useful.
Sure.
And so the Hagia Sophia would be another great example.
Sure.
You pair these two buildings together. And so I was there. I was at the Mesquita last month.
Sure, great.
And I saw a very large contingent of Muslim people who were going through the museum. So I think this building is certainly a World Heritage Site, but I can't see that it's possible to be able to demarcate, especially in Abrahamic religions, Christianity or Muslim, and a building that is set within ultimately a nation that becomes Christian after 1492, that the building isn't going to be used by both cultures. And that evolution has to be taken into consideration as part of the identity process of the transition of culture through time and space in a place that's called Spain. Ultimately, al-Andalus isn't al-Andalus today, it's Andalusia. And so you have to also take into consideration Andalusia, the place within which Cordoba has developed over 1,000 years or more. The Roman bridge is still in Cordoba, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so and the columns that are within the Mesquita are actually Roman and Greek architecture from temples that were carried in, because that was one of the ways in which buildings were built back during that time. You disassembled a temple from another religion and carried their materials over and rebuilt yours. So this also has Greek and Roman pagan elements within it as well. It has to be taken consideration of. And I don't think any place on the planet Earth there's something like some space or some building or some material that can have some unique identity to itself without sharing the whole sense of human religious experience, in this case, or consciousness. People are going to come in and out of a space over long lengths of time, and they're going to leave their footprint or their sense of place to it, their spirit.
Yeah, well, I think we actually agree. Maybe I misspoke. I mean, I can completely agree with the statement that this building is the result of a continuous management and negotiation of shape that's been used by different communities over time, including communities that were in this area before the arrival of Islam in the 8th century, and that any understanding of the building has to have that fluid interaction and movement of peoples and cultures at its center. I think maybe where I would respectfully disagree would be when I see, the only reason that let me see if I can get back to this. The only reason that the cathedral chapter removed this brochure is because they were forced to by law, by and so when I see this, I actually see the opposite of what you're saying. I see this as a pretty assertive attempt to say, put their finger on the scale and say, no, this is a cathedral and nothing else. I'm not making necessarily the argument. Of course, I'm not making the argument that this building's really important Christian heritage shouldn't be taken into account. I'm just trying to tell a story about how many people in Cordoba felt that there was a progressive and increasingly hostile campaign to try to downplay the building's Muslim heritage. something that you said that's also really interesting to think about is that you saw a lot of Muslim tourists in the building, and you're absolutely right. I think precisely right now, Cordoba is in this 10-year strategic plan that's called Cordoba Halal, in which they're trying to situate themselves as a major destination for Muslim tourists and for Muslim friendly business. This has this kind of like all these different tentacles that go far beyond the mosque cathedral. I talk about this in the book a little bit. And so really, I think that this building, like all of al-Andalus, is a story of contradictions. It is both, I'm not saying that one is true and the other. It is both true that Cordoba is actively promoting itself as a friendly tourism site for Muslims, and that hundreds of thousands of Muslim tourists go there every year. And at the same time, that many Muslims have reported harassment of the site, and many Muslim organizations in the city have expressed some reservations about the way that the site is being managed. I think both sides, I think that understanding this building and understanding al-Andalus itself is really about trying to keep contradictory propositions in your mind at the same time. Both things are true. It can both be true that this is a symbol of multiculturalism and also a flashpoint for a reassertion of Catholic identity. It is both true that Cordoba is promoting itself as a destination for Muslim tourism and also is a site of a lot of ongoing aggression and hostility to some of the tourists who go there. I think all of those things are true.
I know that we're over time. We understand if people need to leave, but if you're able to stay, we'll do the 3 questions that I know are on the floor. 1, 2, 3. Oh, we'll do the 2 questions. Okay. Andy.
Yes, first of all, I guess I need to congratulate you on your scholarship and your style of presentation. It's very enlightening to hear.
Thank you.
I was not aware of the tensions that have been going on now for 10 years, more than that. And is I don't know, is not a revelation. I think it's a function of our society, tensions. And I see that tension even within the church itself. And I believe you alluded to some of that when you mentioned the money issue. I see from the outside, and you correct me if I'm wrong, from the outside and based on the presentation, I see that local dioceses being one that wants to keep the purse and the tourist money and all that is brought into the church, as opposed to Pope Francis and a more elevated convivencia attitude, ecumenism that exists in the Catholic Church. So the tension is there between the local dioceses and the Pope in the Vatican. Do you see that, or am I just imagining that?
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question, and I really appreciate it. I think it's obviously important to recognize that Catholics, like Muslims, like Texans, are not a monolith. That all groups have major variations within them, and certainly the Catholic Church. Although at times I might have referred to church authorities, I really tried to stress the cathedral chapter because I was really trying to locate this story within a very specific part of the Catholic Church in Spain. I think it's true that, we've seen just in the past, say, if we look at the past 2 or 3 popes, an evolution in different understandings of what Catholicism is and should be right now, and what its relationship is to kind of diverse Catholics and also the diversity of faiths around the world. I will say that one of the kind of layovers of the Franco regime in Spain is that a lot of the ecclesiastical authorities that acquired power or that continued in power in the 1970s and 80s did have kind of right-wing affiliations to the Spanish Falange, and also in many cases are associated with Opus Dei, so a kind of more conservative branch of the Catholic Church, and that would include all the recent leaders of the cathedral chapter are affiliated with Opus Dei in Cordoba. And so you could also, I've used this building as a parable to help us think about the complex and unresolved meanings of Islam in Spain. But in many ways, we could use it as a parable for understanding the complex and unresolved meanings of Catholicism in Spain. I think that there is and have been versions of Spanish Catholicism that have been very ecumenical and open to and interested in the Islamic heritage. So this is, and by no means am I trying to paint Spanish Catholics or even the Catholic institutions in Spain with a broad brush. And I appreciate the question very much. I should also mention that some of the most famous early Spanish Arabists who helped us rediscover some of the legacy of al-Andalus in the 19th century, many of them were actually Catholic priests. And so, like it's, I'm not trying to put Catholicism in direct contradiction with al-Andalus, but rather try to show what's happening on the ground at this specific moment and try to tease out what it might tell us about what al-Andalus means today.
These are mostly observations rather than questions.
Sure.
First of all, SMU has been blessed with two of the best professors ever in terms of Spanish history, Jeremy Adams and Luis Martín. So those of us who have been able to study over them, I was Jeremy's teaching assistant, know a lot about Spanish history. Secondly, I don't believe you mentioned it, but the images in the church, I mean, in the Cordoba now, aren't they the floats that are used in the Semana Santa processionals?
Sometimes there's a little bit of flux, but I think I showed an image at some point of the Nazarenos, which are these images of Jesus carrying the
yes,
cross.
And
those are often incorporated into
these are on the floats of the Semana Santa. Number one. All right. Thirdly, I think this is all part of my term, militant evangelical Christianity that is going on right now as we speak, with a man who has been our president, who actually was barring anybody, Muslim, from entering this country. I'm sure you're aware of that.
I believe we're talking about Trump. I just want to make sure I'm
yes, that one.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. I think that you're trying to associate this story to, of course, part of what I'm arguing in this book is that al-Andalus is helpful for understanding Spanish identity, but it's also helpful for understanding identity debates all around the world. And I think it is hard, or it's I could say it's easy to associate the story with similar debates that are happening all around the world about how we understand our human diversity, how we understand the construction of national identity at a time of flows of new groups coming in and reconfiguring how we understand a place. And so certainly I think that there's a lot of conceptual overlap between this story and some of the same identity debates that are happening in the United States today.
And then another thing I wanted to just observe, I'm a lifetime Highland Park resident and have always wondered about all the Spanish influence on the Highland Park Town Hall, Highland Park Shopping Village, circa 1945. It's beautifully done. I mean, it's not tacky Spanish stuff. It is very, very well done. The street names, Loma Alto, Granada. There is a Granada street also. You may not. And if you would like a tour, I'd be glad to take you around. Well, I used to do this as a graduate student. Whenever new professors would come down here, Jeremy would have me give them, the grand tour, as a native with a bone in my nose. That was what I would do for all the various Spanish, people, not Spanish, but the various historians who came to study at SMU, because it has a wonderful history of being a very inclusive history department. And again, looking at things with a wonderful eye through the eyes of Jeremy and Luis.
Well, I think if you'll allow me just to jump off of that comment, which I appreciate, I think just the fact of this lecture series and of this exhibit is a testament to that generous and open spirit. And I think it's also, although I've not yet visited the exhibit, I've enjoyed the slides of it through seeing Cristina's lectures, a testament to the incredible richness of the Spanish collection here at the Meadows Museum. And so I can't imagine a better place to be able to present this work. And I'm grateful for the offer for a tour. And if my schedule allows it, I'd love to see it, because I'm always up for seeing Andalusi echoes all around the world.
Show you all of it, the good bits and the bad bits.
Okay, I'm there for all of it. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm just going to jump in to thank you for all the work, for traveling to be with us. This was a really wonderful way to, I think, culminate a lecture series, is when you leave with your mind turning with new ideas, new questions. So thank you for that gift and for being here today. And I'd also like to thank again Cristina Aldrich for really being the driving force, not just with the exhibition, but also for putting this series together. So thank you both very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.